Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Reznick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here at the Lister Hill Auditorium at the National Library of Medicine and all of you viewing remotely for our World War I Centenary Forum, Stories from the Collections of the National Library of Medicine. This forum is part of our History of Medicine lecture series, which promotes awareness and use of NLM and other historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the National Library of Medicine to recognizing and celebrating diversity. All of our lectures are free and open to the public, and all of our lectures are also live streamed and archived by NIH Videocasting, a public service which is made possible through a generous gift from the Michael E. Dubuque Medical Foundation. Additionally, for those of you on Twitter, you can follow this lecture and all of our lectures at #NLMHistTalk. And for all of you who are out there today watching and following on Twitter, welcome. Our program today takes place 100 years to the week when, on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress requesting a declaration of war against Germany, arguing that, quote, "the world must be made safe for democracy," end quote. 4 days later, 100 years ago today, on April 6th, Congress declared war on Germany and her allies. By the time the United States entered the war, the conflict had been going on for nearly 3 years. During the 19 months that would follow, until the war officially ended on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, more than 4 million Americans would serve both overseas and at home. More than 100,000 Americans would lose their lives in the war, and hundreds of thousands more survived the conflict with illnesses and injuries. This week, as we reflect on this moment in American and indeed world history, in cooperation with so many other cultural organizations here in the US and around the world, we pause to recall the wartime history of our own institution, the National Library of Medicine, when it was known as the Army Medical Library, housed in this building, the Old Red Brick, as contemporaries called it, whose architect was Adolf Klus, a prominent architect of Washington, D.C. during the late 19th century. This building was located on the National Mall. In the tradition of public service, which continues to this day, staff of our predecessor institution made their own contributions during this period as they undertook their duties to collect, preserve, and curate materials of the day that documented America's engagement with what was then called the War to End All Wars. Here, in this photo, bathed in light coming through the windows of the reading room of the Old Red Brick, are just two of the dozens of individuals who worked at the Army Medical Library during this period. This picture was taken a few years before the beginning of the war in 1914. These individuals and their colleagues began to feel the impact of the war shortly after the conflict began in 1914. Many European medical publications that the library had been acquiring soon stopped arriving due to the German U-boat campaign against merchant ships in Atlantic shipping lanes. When the United States entered the war, and when its War Department called men into service, these changes affected the personnel of the library profoundly, since it was largely staffed by Army clerks. Recognizing that the library could not function without much of its staff, the Army allowed the leadership of the library for the first time to hire women in large numbers to maintain operations of the institution. Many of the women stayed at the library until their retirement. Among these female wartime hires were Audrey Morgan, MD, and Loy McAfee, MD. This is Dr. McAfee. Unfortunately, little is known about Dr. McAfee, but we do know that she became a compiler for the Index Catalog, one of the seminal publications of the library at that time, and that she developed special topic bibliographies. Her projects very likely included this publication, the Index Medicus War Supplement, a classified record of literature on military medicine and surgery, 1914 to 1917. The editor of this publication was this gentleman, Fielding H. Garrison, the renowned medical historian, bibliographer, and librarian of medicine. Garrison became assistant librarian of the Army Medical Library in 1899 and principal assistant librarian in 1912. He joined the U.S. Army Officer Reserve Corps as a major in 1917. This picture was taken around then. He rose to the ranks of lieutenant colonel in 1918 and then colonel in 1920. Among historians of medicine, Garrison is known for writing the first comprehensive treatise on the history of medicine, as well as contributing to this seminal work, The Medical Department of the United States Army in the World War. In 1917, the leadership of the Army Medical Library identified the importance of collecting and preserving the experiences of the U.S. Army Medical Department in the Great War. the Army Surgeon General created a history division within the library to research and edit, write, and publish this important history. Now, Garrison and his contemporaries took on this work based on an equally important precedent, namely the work of the Army Medical Library dedicated to realizing what was called the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, the official medical history of the U.S. Civil War. I'll get back to that. This gentleman, Merritt Ireland, was one of the editors. This is the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. Merritt Ireland was one of the editors of the World War I medical history, and he wrote about both publications, the World War I medical history and the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, in his introduction to the first volume of the World War I series. The purpose of the history of the medical department in the World War is twofold, wrote Ireland. It is intended not only as the permanent written record of the accomplishments of the medical department in the war, thus rendered available for study with a view to the betterment of that department for the future, but also as a contribution to medical science. That it will be of great value from both standpoints may be fairly assumed, judging by what has happened with similar histories previous published. Of this, our own history of the Civil War is one of the most notable examples, he wrote. Described in its pages is the masterly medical organization of Letterman, on which had been based that of all modern armies, and which, in certain subjects even yet, notwithstanding revolutionary changes in medical, surgical, and sanitary practice in the meantime, is accepted throughout the world as one of the highest authorities on mass scientific information to be gathered only from war experience, involving carefully kept records based on observations made of hundreds of thousands of men. And Ireland continued, this history should be regarded too, and he's speaking now of World War I medical history, as a monument to those who, constituting the medical department of the Army, contributed to the success of our nation at arms by preventing disease, by rapid cure of ill and injured, with restoration to duty, and by sustaining morale through prompt rescue of wounded in battle, and who, at all times, gave skillful and tender care to sick and wounded officers and soldiers. That such a monument, he concluded, might actually be erected is due to the liberality of the Congress of the United States. So, published over 8 years, from 1921 to 1929, this comprehensive 15-volume series covered subjects ranging from general surgery to hygiene, orthopedics to combat disorders, hospitals to gas warfare. Here we can see medical advances of the period, from transportation of the war wounded, to wound disinfection, to surgery, to repair of severe damage wrought by mechanized warfare. These volumes also hold a wealth of knowledge and data about regional and local efforts to prepare for war and how communities of medical caregivers and voluntary aid groups like those involved with the Red Cross, the YMCA, and the Salvation Army served returning soldiers and their families. You can find this seminal publication, as well as the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, in NLM digital collections, alongside hundreds of other wartime and post-war publications, which together help to reveal the unifying experience of the war for America, as well as the aftermath of the conflict as the nation welcomed home more than 300,000 wounded servicemen. We're going to hear about some of these experiences today through our forum, which highlights just a small selection of NLM's rich historical collections related to World War I and Americans' experience on the battlefield, behind the lines, and on the home front. Together, as you will hear and learn, these collections open windows onto deeply personal experiences of the physical and emotional effects of the war, as well as examples of the visual iconography that extolled and supported life-saving medical endeavors abroad. I'm proud to say that our speakers this afternoon are my colleagues in the NLM's History of Medicine Division, Ginny Roth, Stephen J. Greenberg, and Sarah Eilers. I'll introduce all of them in that order, the order that they will be presenting, and then we'll begin our program, and we'll follow it with a question and answer period. First, Ginny Roth. She is the curator of prints and photographs in the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine. Ginny earned her bachelor's degree in English from Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania. After moving to the DC area in 2003, she decided to pursue librarianship and earned her Master's of Library Science from Catholic University. In combining her interest in librarianship with her interest in the visual arts, Ginny worked as an image collection manager at George Mason University, and she came to the library here in 2008 as curator for the Prints and Photographs program in the History of Medicine Division. Stephen Greenberg received his doctorate in early modern history from Fordham University with a dissertation on early printing and publishing. After teaching for several years, he returned to school and earned his library degree from Columbia University, specializing in rare books and archival management. Since 1992, he's worked in the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine, and he's currently head of the Rare Books and Manuscripts section. His research and publications are numerous, and they span several fields, including the history of printing and publishing, and the history of medical librarianship, and the history of medical photography. And Sarah Eilers will conclude our program today. She oversees the Historical Audiovisuals collection for the History of Medicine Division. This collection includes about 10,000 health, medical, and scientific titles in film, tape, and other formats. Sarah earned her master's in library science with a specialization in archives from the University of Maryland, College Park. She also has a master's degree in government from the University of Texas at Austin, and she worked for many years in community development and affordable housing. She joined the National Library of Medicine as a contractor in 2005 and became a full-time employee in 2015. Please join me in thanking all three of my colleagues for their presentations today, and we'll welcome Ginny Roth as our first presenter. And thank you all again for coming. Ginny?
Good afternoon. I'm Ginny Roth, the curator for the Prints and Photographs program in HMD. Today, I'm going to talk about and show you how women were represented in American Red Cross posters and postcards during World War I. With the American Declaration of War in 1917 came a call to arms, and thousands of men registered for military service. Women, too, were answered the call by enlisting in the military, by joining the Red Cross as a volunteer, and by dedicating themselves in other productive ways to support the war effort. By the war's end, thousands of women supported the war effort through their work with the Red Cross. Clara Barton was a field nurse during the Civil War, transporting supplies to the battlefields and tending to wounded soldiers. Putting herself at risk of being killed, Barton brought relief to the wounded by means of providing comfort, support, and assisting burdened surgeons who were surrounded by injured and dying soldiers, both in field hospitals and on the battleground. After the Civil War, Barton was introduced to the Red Cross in Geneva, Switzerland, and learned of the humanitarian services of the Global Red Cross Network. From her experiences in the Civil War, Barton understood the needs of victims in battle, and in 1870 went to the war zone of the Franco-Prussian War with volunteers of the International Red Cross, where Barton helped distribute relief supplies in France. Upon her return to the United States, Barton campaigned for an American Society of the Red Cross, which was established as the American Association of the Red Cross in 1881 with Barton as president. The American Red Cross moved in a new direction near the end of Barton's tenure as head of the organization when they delivered supplies and services to Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Recipients of Red Cross aid included members of the American Armed Forces, prisoners of war, and Cuban refugees. This was the first time that the American Red Cross provided assistance to American armed forces and civilians during wartime. The American Red Cross received its first congressional charter in 1900. Its second charter, received in 1905, remains in effect today. The charter outlines the purpose of the organization to provide relief for American armed forces, serve as a communication channel between the soldiers and their families, and provide national and international disaster relief. The postcard that you're seeing here was issued in 1994 by the United States Postal Service as part of a collection of postcards featuring famous figures from the Civil War. When America went to war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson urged the public to help the Red Cross to meet the needs of the thousands of men joining the Allied forces. Subsequently, the public's sense of patriotic duty was at a high as American troops made their way into Europe. Red Cross membership increased rapidly. According to the Red Cross, at the beginning, the organization consisted of only about 16,000 adult members. By the war's end, nearly one-third of the U.S. population was either a donor to the Red Cross or served as a volunteer. In all, over 20 million adults claimed membership in the American Red Cross, more than 8 million adults were volunteers, and 11 million children had joined the Junior Red Cross. The organization played a crucial role in coordinating volunteer efforts by providing emergency food and medical relief on the battlefields, raising money, distributing relief supplies overseas, building hospitals, and training ambulance drivers. Public health campaigns have long involved a variety of media to help communicate their objectives. The Red Cross used an effective poster campaign to inspire citizens, primarily women, to participate in the war, either through service, work, or financial means. Red Cross recruitment posters were common, as were appeals for monetary donations and volunteers. Broadly disseminated, the American Red Cross used posters to recruit female volunteers, raise funds and expand awareness, boost morale and garner support, instate the American public's patriotic duty, display real photographs of Red Cross workers and soldiers, and illustrate women in non-traditional roles and emphasize their importance in the war effort. Visually striking illustrations of wounded soldiers on the battlefield, combined with patriotic messages, national symbolism such as the American flag, and even religious overtones were ubiquitous and mass-produced beginning in 1917. Illustrators were commissioned to create these images, generally dramatizing scenes that would elicit emotional responses from women, thus encouraging them to take action in any number of ways. These two Red Cross recruitment posters effectively illustrate the Red Cross nurse as both the guardian and the hero. The poster on the left, created by artist John Mills, depicts a Red Cross nurse helping a wounded soldier on the battlefield. The poster on the right, created by artist Herman Rogue, is a dramatic representation of a Red Cross nurse taking command of the well-being of a wounded soldier. Posters and postcards that targeted women to volunteer were persuasive. Not only were women depicted as guardians, but nurses working on the battlefields were commonly depicted as angels. When soldiers were wounded and helpless, they appeared beside the nurses, who became a symbol of hope. The poster on the left illustrates the Red Cross nurses as a spiritual and comforting and angelic in the way the light seems to be beaming down on them. One nurse is beckoning the help of another woman, demonstrating the need to help a wounded soldier. The poster on the right features a prominent picture of a nurse with a stoic expression against the backdrop of military barracks, revealing her as a protector of the soldiers. The war gave women a chance to prove their capabilities and, in turn, garnered respect from the public and had their patriotic endeavors taken seriously. The postcard on the left shows the empowerment of women in the war as the backbone of the operation on the battlefield. This is an example of such propaganda that appeals for funds, implying that a soldier's fate could be determined by a civilian's generosity, or lack thereof. On the left, you see a Red Cross nurse helping both a wounded soldier and a civilian with a baby, answering the question, "What can you do?" appealing to women to join the Red Cross even without prior field service experience. Both of these images reaffirm the necessity of women in the war effort. In 1917 and 1918, the U.S. government raised money to help finance the war by selling Liberty Bonds, so named to appeal to the patriotism of Americans. The U.S. government Liberty Bonds were a special issue of World War I U.S. government bonds to petition the people to help pay for the war and encourage Americans to save rather than spend, thereby controlling inflation during the wartime economy. By buying Liberty Bonds, Americans were loaning the government money, which the government agreed to pay back plus interest in a specified number of years. Subscribing to the bonds became a symbol of patriotic duty in the United States. Propaganda posters and postcards, such as the one that you're seeing here, where a bomb is exploding directly behind a nurse caring for a soldier, successfully convinced Americans to do their part in the war effort. The implication here being that even hospitals are not immune to destruction, and buying bonds to support the war would shield our girls, how they are referred to in the postcard, and protect hospitals from danger. Animals notoriously played a crucial role in World War I. Pigeons served as reliable messengers. Dogs likewise were used as messengers, but also for finding wounded soldiers. Horses were used for transportation and to pull heavy machinery, and slugs were even used to detect mustard gas. They would compress their bodies as a reaction to disgust when the odor was present. Campaign efforts also used animals to symbolize and publicize the Red Cross. Featured here is the Red Cross Liberty Duck. The animals helped to raise funds, collect goods, and recruit human volunteers. They attracted attention and successfully created positive feelings towards the Red Cross. In 1917 and 1918, 2 war fund drives were held during which the nation was called upon to support the war. The drive was kicked off by Woodrow Wilson's speech on May 18, 1918, in which he states the goal for America was not only to win the war, but to demonstrate character, not only on the battlefield, but by supporting the Red Cross. This propaganda poster, designed to recruit volunteers, primarily women, and solicit funds, depicts a woman draped in the U.S. flag with a quote from President Woodrow Wilson's speech, "I summon you to comradeship in the Red Cross," calling on citizens to do their patriotic duty and join the Red Cross. President Wilson was honorary chairman of the Red Cross at that time. This poster represents how women of all classes were stepping out of their traditional roles and into jobs typically occupied by men. Women were taking over the responsibilities of men in the workforce who had to abandon their jobs to join the war effort. Women were recruited not only for nursing, but to work in munition factories, drive ambulances, work as telephone operators, and as farm workers. This poster, which also ran during the Second War Fund Drive, as the other one was, is an example of a propaganda poster directed towards women, declaring the importance of women to hold up their end and take part in the war effort. Another 2 posters from the Second War Fund Drive depict women as having both godlike and empowered roles in the war. The poster on the left once again illustrates the Red Cross nurse as angelic and is referred to as the Hand of Mercy. The poster on the right, with a Red Cross nurse depicted as a leader on the battlefield, was produced by the Allied Theatrical and Motion Picture Team, a group formed by the entertainment industry to hold American Red Cross benefits and raise money from members of their profession, the Allied industries, and the millions of people who attended their performances. In total, the war funds brought in about $280 million. On a side note, the artist James Montgomery Flagg, who produced the poster on the right, created 46 posters between 1917 and 1919. He was commissioned by the federal government to do so, and they were distributed during World War I. This is his most famous work and the one that people are most familiar with. The original watercolor of Uncle Sam, created by Flagg, first appeared on the July 6 cover of Frank Leslie's illustrated weekly newspaper in 1916. Flagg created this lithograph in 1917 for recruitment purposes when the U.S. entered the war. Over 4 million copies of this poster were printed between 1917 and 1918 as the U.S. entered World War I. It was so successful that the image was later adapted for use in World War II in 1941. Another annual funding campaign was the American Red Cross Christmas Roll Call, which took place in 1918 from December 16th to the 23rd. The poster from the roll call, which took place just after the war ended, depicts a nurse with her hand outstretched in front of marching soldiers in an attempt to evoke from the viewer the urgency of the need to become a subscribing Red Cross member, which at the time was $1 or $2 if you wanted the Red Cross magazine. This appeal for membership in the Red Cross, although having come shortly after the armistice, was needed to support not only the demobilization of troops following the war, but also the worldwide outbreak of influenza, which had begun during the last few months of the war. This poster, also from the Christmas roll call, presents a dramatic portrait of a woman in an expression of both desperation and compassion as she reaches up toward a large symbol of the Red Cross. This theme represents a theatrical fundraiser of the same name that was written by poet and author Percy MacKay in 1918. This postcard is a version of a famous Red Cross poster that was also run during the Christmas roll call of 1918. It features a larger-than-life Red Cross nurse cradling an injured soldier who in her arms looks diminutive and compared to the size of the nurse. The image suggests that the Red Cross collectively was a mother to all those in need. Many have compared the image to that of the Virgin Mary cradling the body of Jesus in Michelangelo's sculpture Pieta. The strength, compassion, and protection offered by Mary was also that which was offered by the Red Cross nurse. This poster was successful in garnering attention and sympathy and encouraged Americans to join the Red Cross during the week of the roll call. By the end of the war, the public had contributed $400 million in funds and material to support the Red Cross programs, which includes funds for American and Allied forces and civilian refugees. During the last few months of the war, when the influenza pandemic spread throughout most of the world and didn't subside until the following year, the Red Cross recruited more than 18,000 nurses and volunteers to work alongside the U.S. Public Health Service to respond to the outbreak. The Red Cross reported that the pandemic claimed the lives of 204 Red Cross nurses. This Red Cross recruitment poster by artist Howard Chandler Christie was one of many images he would paint during and after World War I that featured women rather than fighting soldiers. He was known for portraying women, the American woman, as confident, elegant, and patriotic, as is seen here in this popular poster, The Spirit of America. Post-war, the American Red Cross continued to recruit volunteers and thus ensured they succeeded in their mission to serve veterans, enhance programs in safety training and accident prevention, provide home care for the sick, and provide disaster relief services. Thank you.
I'm Stephen Greenberg, and I'll be talking about the Francis Dupuque Fletcher photo album, but I also want to include a little bit of the history of the photo album as a way of recording historical materials based on items held by the NLM collection. So, Francis Dupuque was born in Washington, D.C. in 1863. She was the daughter of a wealthy physician. And sometime before the outbreak of World War I in 1914, she married an Englishman named Kitty Ray Fletcher, and she moved to Andover in the south of England. When the war broke out, even though she technically was still an American citizen, she received training in the British Red Cross Society, and this is her certificate. And it's a very interesting document in its own right. You can see that she is certified as having attended a course of lectures and demonstrations on home nursing, and she's demonstrated her proficiency, and therefore she has been issued Certificate 24375 on December the 10th, 1914. You'll notice also this is the British Red Cross, so the patron is King George V, and the president is the Queen Alexandra. And I also want to point out along the bottom edge the different parts of the Commonwealth and Empire that are represented by the British Red Cross, including the West Indies, South Africa, New Zealand, India, Australia, Canada, and notice that Newfoundland is considered to be a separate dominion at that point. This is the page from the album. Many of the pictures are pictures we believe were taken by Miss Fletcher herself, and they're very teasing in a way. You have some dates, but no names really, and you rarely see a patient in the hospital situation. They all seem to be convalescing. Eventually, Miss Fletcher moved her operations to the Normandy coast, and she operated a hospital where she was eventually the chief nurse for Field Hospital 23. But let's drop back just a little bit. This is another photo album collected by a nurse, but this is Anna Lowell's album from 1864, when she was the head nurse on Ward K at the Armory Square Hospital here in the District of Columbia. And you can see this was given to her as a parting gift, and you can see the names of the orderlies and attendants who chipped in to buy the album for Miss Lowell. And of course, there's a big difference here. This is an album where you would buy commercially produced pictures and put them in pre-cut slots. And if you could take the pictures out and look on the backs, you'll see that they are produced by the two famous photo studios of the time, Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner. And basically these are about 2-inch by 3-inch pictures that you would then slide in the pre-cut slots. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures made. And you could simply select the ones that you wanted and put them in the little slots. Photography was complicated in the 1860s. It wasn't something that you could pick up and simply do for yourself. And this man changed all that. This is George Eastman. And on the left, you see the original Kodak Brownie camera. You push the button, we do the rest. By the time World War I broke out, a photographer who was interested could get a nice folding camera like these. These are all Kodak products, by the way. They would fold up so they could be put easily into your pocket, taken out, take a good quality picture, and then either develop the film yourself or send the film back. And it's a camera similar to these that Miss Fletcher took with her to the hospital in Normandy. But there's another album in the middle I would like to show you. And it's this one here. In 1916, and actually I can give the exact dates here. Okay. In March of 1916, in order to pursue the Mexican revolutionary / bandit Pancho Villa, Woodrow Wilson sent American troops across the border into Mexico without the permission of the Mexican government, by the way, to try to chase down Pancho Villa. And the NLM collection includes a photo album, which is technically in Ginny's collection. Okay. And these are not commercially produced photographs. Whoever the photographer was, he took these pictures. And in the upper left, you see the man who would eventually command the American Expeditionary Force in France, John Joseph Pershing, when he's still a brigadier general. And you have in the lower right a very crude-looking field hospital. The Punitive Expedition is rather nicely portrayed in the album, but it's an interesting thing because it makes everything the U.S. Army is doing look rather crude. And there are those who believe that the German government decided they didn't have to worry about the United States because if they couldn't simply capture one Mexican revolutionary, how could they bring millions of troops to Europe? And yet within a few months of the return of Pershing from Mexico, that's exactly what happened. So, back to the Dupuis scrapbook. There are lots of interesting memorabilia, not just photographs. For example, this is her pass. You would wear this tied around your arm, by the way. That's why you have the little eyelets, top and bottom. So this is her Red Cross pass to get in and out of the hospital where she was the head nurse. And there are a few commercially made pictures in there as well. So you have on the right a picture of George V. And George V, if you keep track of these things, is the grandfather of the current Queen Elizabeth. And the picture to the right is even more interesting, at least, I'm sorry, on the left, is even more interesting to me. This is General Joffre, eventually Field Marshal. He was the commander of the French army at the beginning of the war. He was known as the savior of Paris. He was the man who stopped the German advance at the Battle of the Marne. And the faintly religious overtones here, he's not looking at the photographer, he's sort of looking off into the middle distance, seeing the eventual victory of the Allies. The religious overtones are even stronger here. You have, the Sacred Heart, and you have, all the different religious symbolism required to keep the people together. And the picture on the right, I find even a little scarier. This is a chromolithograph postcard, which you would purchase, and a part of the proceeds of the postcard would go to buy bread for the children of soldiers. And if your French is about mine, you'll see that you're getting 2 sous. That's not an awful lot of money. And for every 2 sous that you give, you will be giving a pound of bread to the family of a soldier. And that's a little scary. The hospital in Normandy was not a field hospital. It wasn't at the battlefront. It was well behind the lines. And so you were able to do more elaborate convalescing and programming here. So here is the program for a benefit concert that was being held, in fact, for the Italian Red Cross in July of 1915. And you can see you have the ticket of admission. It appears they had a casino night. It's partially covered by the red banner here, but you can see that suddenly it's the casino for this evening here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And it's going to be for the benefit of French, Russian, Belgian, and Italian soldiers. And again, you have a mixture here of commercially made photographs. This is the Houliet building where Fletcher ran her hospital, and then many pictures of different soldiers. This seems to be a funeral of some sort, but again, you have names. It's All Saints' Day, 1915, but you don't know very much more about it. And again, pictures of nurses looking very much the way that they appear in the posters that Ginny represented to us earlier. But you know very little about the individuals. I mean, I'm guessing that this soldier is French rather than English just simply because of his kepi, his hat. And it's rather tantalizing. I am assuming that a lot of these pictures here were taken by Fletcher because they seem to have been taken with the same camera. And the others that are bigger and smaller may have been taken with another camera. So I guess in conclusion, what I would say is this. You have an artifact here. And these pictures are mostly available in the NLM Digital Collections website. But it's the context that you need as well. Because when you hold this thing in your hand and you see this fairly brief period in 1914, 1915 with Mrs. Fletcher's career, we don't know much about her after that. We don't know if she stayed in France after the war, but whether the hospital was there for the influenza epidemic. I have been told by several sources that she retained her American citizenship, which would have been extremely difficult since she was married to a British Army officer serving in a British military hospital. And that was a good way to lose your American citizenship under the laws that were in effect, the neutrality laws in effect during the First World War. But you have kind of a context that the individual pictures by themselves do not give you. So thank you very much.
Are you left-handed? Are you left-handed? The mouse was over here. Hello, everybody. Okay. I'm Sarah Eilers. I am here representing the Historical Audiovisuals Collection within HMD. And I'm going to show you a silent film fragment from 1918 that depicts the work of American sculptor Anna Coleman Ladd, who, with the help of the American Red Cross, established something called the Studio of Portrait Masks in Paris, where she worked with plaster, copper, and paint to construct and fit masks for soldiers who had suffered grievous facial wounds in the First World War. Anna Ladd was born in 1878 in Philadelphia. She studied sculpting at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. She moved to Boston in 1905, and she married a pediatrician named Maynard Ladd, who served in France in a medical capacity during the war also. She was a prolific sculptor in Boston and beyond. She created fountain pieces, portrait busts, memorials, and reliefs, in addition to authoring 2 novels. And between 1907 and 1915, she had solo exhibitions at the Gorham Gallery in New York, the Corcoran in Washington, and the Pennsylvania Academy in Philadelphia. She was well known and her work much admired. This is a note from Ida Tarbell, whom we know is one of the leading muckrakers of the Progressive era, expressing interest in visiting Ladd's studio in Boston. During the course of the Great War, Anna Ladd heard about the work of a British sculptor named Francis Derwent Wood, and she began corresponding with him. He was creating masks for injured British soldiers at London's Tin Noses shop. That was the unofficial name for it. He had been an orderly at the 3rd London General Hospital in 1915, and he saw what surgery could and could not do at that time for injured soldiers. So he established this studio, whose official name was the Masks for Facial Disfigurement Department, but again, unofficially, the Tin Noses shop. And what he said about his work was, when the surgeon has done all he can to restore function, I endeavor by means of the skill I happen to possess as a sculptor to make a man's face as near as possible to what it looked like before he was wounded. Faces were especially vulnerable in trench warfare. Soldiers thought they could pop up for a millisecond and they would be okay, but these looks up and over often resulted in serious head or face wounds. In many cases, men who had been at the front, had been in the trenches and been injured, were unwilling to return to their families or go out in public. They were so disfigured. So Ladd established the studio of portrait masks not only to restore a more normal appearance to people like Charles Victor here, but also to serve as a refuge where soldiers could relax and interact without embarrassment. So here we see Ladd in her Red Cross uniform. You'll see her wearing that later. She had to get an official exception in order to go to France, as wives of physicians were prohibited from working there if their husbands were with the army. I don't know why it was physicians specifically, but she sailed in November 1917 after getting her exception. The silent film I'm about to run is called Plastic Reconstruction of Face, and it depicts Ladd and her assistants, several assistants at work in the studio. Not much is known about the production and distribution of the film. It's just a fragment. It's very brief. We know it was shot in 1918 because that's the year that Ladd did her work. That's when she ran the studio. And NLM received it in 1992 from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. We don't know who shot it or if there is additional footage somewhere else. This is just, as I said, a 5-minute fragment, but I've not found anything more. I'll scoot it ahead a little bit. So you see the film was not in great shape when we got it. We don't know who this is. We don't see this person again. So I'm guessing that the studio shared quarters with other offices or something with a different function. And the first thing that you're going to see, it should be coming up in just a second, is a fitting. This is Anna Ladd, and she is fitting a mask on this soldier, and you'll see that they were often, wires behind the ears were used to hold the mask, or sometimes eyeglasses. It was attached to eyeglasses. She had, I'll wait just a second. So he's going to put it back on, and he looks really pretty average when he puts it back on and shows you his profile. She had several assistants. There was a French sculptor named Jane Poupelet and a man called Robert Blerick, who I believe you'll see in just a moment. There were also 2 Americans, someone who in the book that I was checking for information on Anna Ladd was just referred to as Miss Blair, and another American sculptor named Mary Louise Brent. So the typical process for creating these masks was a plaster cast was made of the healed face, and that's what you see up in the back there. And then modeled on this, a plasticine mask of features as they were before the war, using a photo if they had one, or maybe descriptions from friends or family members, or just a guess if not. Anna Ladd said she would sometimes just kind of have a feeling or a sense of what was missing, the shape of what was missing. A wax mold was then made and placed in an electric bath of copper sulfate, which you'll see in just a moment. Once it was placed in the copper sulfate, a thin copper film, a very thin and light copper film was formed, and this was the mask. It was light enough to be worn comfortably all day. The lips were usually left slightly open in the masks, and this was just to simulate a more natural look, as well as to make smoking, breathing, and speaking easier. So here she's going to put it in this seems to be a section for prosthetic ear. She's going to put it into the copper sulfate bath, and then you'll see her kind of fiddle with the knobs for the current. They used for eyelashes thin, very, very thin metal threads, and had used the same thing for mustaches. But a lot of the soldiers had grown their own mustaches before the war, and they didn't like the feel of the metal thread. So then they started using human hairs to make the mustaches. And so here's Anna Ladd again, putting the finishing touches. Once the mask was fitted on, she would then, or whoever was doing it, would paint the copper mask as close as possible to the skin tone of the soldier. So that from a distance, they really looked very normal. And this made it possible to go out and about and shop, walk up and down the street, and not feel like people were staring at you or unable to bear the sight of you. And this one, I think, is one that is going to be fitted on and held on with eyeglasses and spectacles. So this man is being fitted for a prosthetic. You see it's going over his mouth and his right eye. When they remove it, you see his profile. You see that his face has been flattened by his injuries. With the mask on, he has features again. War moves medicine forward. I think we all know that, but it would be some time before these types of facial injuries could be surgically remedied. Most of the men who came to Anna Ladd's studio had been through multiple surgeries, multiple operations, and while some function might be restored or appearance improved, in the end, covering the injury was often the only option left. There were, however, considerable advances in facial surgery, as well as in burn treatment, infection control, splinting, and other areas as a result of World War II traumas. Here's Ladd at work in her studio. One French soldier wrote her. She received a lot of letters and a lot of thanks from the soldiers, as you might imagine, and one wrote her, "Thanks to you, I will have a home. The woman I love no longer finds me repulsive as she had a right to do. She will be my wife. Ladd remained through most of 1918 and then returned to Boston. This is a note from Executive Committee of the American Red Cross, and they're thanking her for her contribution and referring to her work as one of the saddest and most important features of the war. Her services earned her the highest military honor in France, the National Order of the Legion of Honor, at the rank of Knight or Chevalier, as well as the Serbian Order of St. Sava. Ladd said, "My object was not simply to provide a man a mask to hide his awful mutilation, but to put in that mask part of the man himself, that is, the man he had been before tragedy intervened." Thank you. And I think now we'll take questions.
So we've got about a half an hour for any questions that any of you here in the audience have, or if anyone is watching online and they are on Twitter, we're at hashtag NLM Hist Talk. So any questions here or out there? Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. Ginny, I had a question for you about the postcards. I mean, were they, I guess, were they used as collectibles or actually used, or what was, were they postcards?
The postcards, a lot of the ones that we have were actually mailed. So a lot of them do have messages on the backs of them. Most of the ones that we have are later than the World War I postcards are, but these were collected by a nurse and from all over the world. So, yeah, a lot of them are stamped and written on.
Thank you.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is also for Ginny. Well, actually, coming out of Steve's talk, though, he'd mentioned the photo album, which is in the Princeton Photos collection, and the lack of information about a lot of the images in there. So I was just wondering, what efforts do you make, what resources are available to try to improve the provenance of something like that? When you have something, are there any steps, or are there any paths that you can go down to try to figure out kind of some of the details?
Not really. I mean, these have been in the collection for decades, and unfortunately, records of acquisitions were not kept. And when things made it over here from the Army Medical Library, there really were no records of where they came from. So we can only sometimes assume what their past was or who gave them to us based on the content or information that's in the item itself. So we could date them often, even if there's no date on it, but it's hard for us to know exactly where it came from.
If I could answer a little bit on that as well. In a case like the Punitive Expedition, there are no specific names attached. In the case of the Fletcher album, we know who she was, and we can get a little bit that way. But sometimes the work that will be required simply exceeds the amount of time, the facilities we have. I suspect that if I went to England, I could probably find more information about her, because I do not believe she ever came back to the U.S.
Other questions?
Yeah. Following up on that, I just wonder for some of these things whether we might take an approach of, making them available and maybe engaging some group within the UK, within England to say, crowdsource this thing. Has anybody, seen any of these people or got copies of these pictures or whatever? It's in a much easier case. I did that when I gave a lecture that had pictures from 61, 71, whatever, and these were colleagues, and I didn't recognize some of them in the medical library thing, and I put it up there, and immediately I got a message from somebody saying, "That's my husband Charles, right there." You know, so obviously this is a long time ago for some of the things, but you never know. Particularly when everyone's focused on World War I.
We actually do that sometimes. If you follow the Circulating Now blog, we recently had a blog post about a 4-edge painting. And I circulated still pictures through some of the listservs to see if any other copy of the book had that painting. So we do that. But sometimes the trail is very cold.
And actually, on occasion, we have so many military photos of soldiers who are unidentified, and we have gotten messages from people that say, "That's my great-grandfather," just out of the blue. And so we'll get a lot of information that way, kind of serendipitously.
And additionally, I think as our digital collections repository grows, the URL of which I offered in my introduction, as we are able to ingest and serve more images and in the future manuscript content, I can certainly envision greater engagement with the public in that regard, which is going to be very exciting to be able to identify provenance and make connections between the material objects and the people whose families they are represented. So it's very exciting. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, this is a question for Sarah. I loved the video, and I was curious. I know it's just the quality of a 1918 film, but maybe also just she has such a fine touch with the work. So I was curious to know if there is examples of her facial prostheses in other collections or museums, because it would be great to see kind of a high quality photo of something like that today.
You're wondering if there's a collection that actually holds the masks or holds
an example.
I don't know. I heard from someone over at the Museum of Health and Medicine that they thought they might have a couple of the plaster molds that were the first thing made, but they couldn't really trace the provenance. They couldn't sort of imagine what else it might be, although there was Frances Derwentwood and then Anna Ladd, and there may have been even a couple of other people who did this sort of thing. But I don't know, and that actually kind of spurs me to in the American Red Cross collection, I wonder if they would have information about that, or a repository in France. But yeah, when you read about it and research it, I have not found references saying, and here's an example of where this material might be. After Anna Ladd died, her husband did keep a lot of her sculpture on display and kind of operated it as a museum for people to come see her pieces, but it didn't include this work.
If I could address that for a moment. Sarah's presentation is a fantastic case study in so many contexts, but particularly in terms of the material that she draws on. So she showed a film, she's looked at images, you have archival material, you raised the question of where the material objects are. And it's a case study of how these sources from which we want to build a story, from which Sarah built a story, are scattered. Some of them are here, some are at the Smithsonian, there may be some at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, there may be some at the Red Cross, as Sarah said, and it's a fantastic case study of, quite frankly, not only the case of Reconstruction as it took place through the expertise of Ladd, but the actual process of reconstructing the story from multiple formats held by multiple organizations. And it's a testimony to, I think, her research and also the importance of multiple cultural institutions preserving these objects for future study. So thank you. Other questions? Yes? Excuse me, ma'am, can you press the button so the red light turns on? Because we won't be, there you go.
Okay.
Wonderful, perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned the Punitive Expedition album. Now, is that available for someone to come look at?
Yes, that's the short answer. The images, I believe, are all in digital collections, so the images are available online, but if you would like to examine the physical album, that's available in the History of Medicine Division reading room.
Good. Since I haven't seen it yet, do you have the flyers in there by any chance? That was the first U.S. Army set of flyers, pilots.
I don't recall there being any pictures of aviators in the album. I do know that they did take some planes. Is that any better? I'm cutting in and out, I'm sorry. I do know that they took horses, they took trucks, they took planes, but they're not all represented in the album.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
You may or may not be aware there was recently an American art from World War I exhibit at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. It either just ended or is fixing to end, and they had some photographs of the face masks. I have the catalog. There's a catalog, and so that might be like a lead to more information about. And they obviously they came at it from an artistic perspective, but they overlap. So
Yeah, and in fact, when I was doing my research, another comment made, I think by a physician, was that surgeons could use the masks Anna Ladd made to figure out what sort of facial reconstruction they should be attempting on the operating table, so sort of going in that direction. But no, I didn't know about that exhibit, so I'd like to see that catalog. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you for the presentations. I enjoyed them a lot. I have a somewhat broader question, which I'm not even sure if it's right people to ask. It's I keep reading every now and then in many places that in no other time period than during the First World War, medicine did not progress that rapidly, right? It seems to me that it's many people accept it. And then, if you agree with that, do you know why was it so? Like, for instance, specifically, why during the Second World War, for instance, the medicine didn't advance as rapidly as it did in the First World War? Or do you know any resources on that, or uncertain?
I would challenge the premise that there was not a lot of improvement during the First World War. The use of X-rays to locate bullet fragments was done during the First World War. Marie Curie, who was based in Paris, actually fitted a portable X-ray machine to a truck and drove it out to the front, because for much of the war, the front was about a half an hour drive from downtown Paris. Facial reconstruction, like Sarah describes, a lot of field sanitation. So I would not accept the notion that there was no advance during the war. One of the interesting things about major wars is that each one seems to have its own particular injury. When there's, the technology gives you a new way of killing people. And World War I, you want to switch mics? Yes, am I getting picked up? Okay, my apologies. Okay, World War I gave us poison gas and machine guns. And to deal with that, you had X-rays, you had blood transfusion, though it was very crude. You didn't have a blood bank in the modern sense, but you'd have blood typing, because that had been worked out just a few years before. So I think that I would challenge that as a concept.
If I can piggyback on that, and to your question, you implied, are there useful articles that you might read? The best article, in my humble opinion, that is out there is by a gentleman named Roger Cooter, who's our colleague out in London, used to be at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine at University College London. Dr. Cooter wrote an article that appeared in the Canadian Bulletin of Medical History, and if I recall correctly, 1992 or 93. And the title of the article is Medicine and the Goodness of War. And it addresses your question straight on, the degree to which one can consider war being an engine for innovation, change, improvement, advancement of medicine. And Roger, it's a seminal article. And one of the aspects of the argument that he makes is not always, but oftentimes, innovations in war certainly have roots or precedents during the pre-war period. So advancements in prosthetics, for example, that one might argue occurred during the American Civil War in certain cases. If you look at the 2 or 3 decades before the American Civil War, there were advancements, there were inventions, there were patents filed that had nothing to do with war. They had everything to do with railway accidents. So to peg certain advancements on war is not always the case. Sometimes it is, certainly, particularly when looking at certainly some of the aspects that Dr. Greenberg mentioned, but also the investment of the state in the war machine, whatever it might be. That is to say, the investment of a government to wage war, and the investment of communities, voluntary organizations to support the war effort in local, regional ways. So the concept of war being good for medicine can certainly be true, but in other cases, when you look very intensely at those cases, the argument is not entirely black and white, if you will. So Roger Cooter's article from the Canadian Bulletin of Medical History, 92 or 93, is probably one of the best pieces you could read. And there was a follow-up book that he did with 2 gentlemen, Steve Sturdy, if I remember correctly, and Mark Harrison, a collection of essays on this same subject, spanning not only World War I, but multiple conflicts. So highly recommend the book, whose title I can't remember, but if you see me afterward, I can let you know. But Roger's article is a great piece. Other questions? I'm going to ask Sarah one. Because but I'm going to take the liberty. So I had a question about what hope you have, understanding the film as you do, to identify other fragments or more details about it. So as a film scholar, where do you go to identify that? Is that something that, having it out there, curated the way that you've done, the way that others have done, certainly raises the likelihood that someone will see it and come forward with information about it. But what hope can we have in now, the first quarter of the 21st century, for a film that's 100 years old, that is silent, that is so rare, of knowing more about it?
Well, am I too close? I have, of course, done the low-hanging fruit thing, which is to look on YouTube. Is it out there? Yes. Other people have put this up on YouTube, never a longer fragment than what we have, and no information. So I just wanted to see, sort of casually, are there other places to see this? And there are, but there's no other information. There's far less information than we have about its origins. But I think that there's probably, and I've gone back to the original file when the film was transferred to us, and it was transferred in 92, I think I said, along with a number of other unrelated, they weren't World War I films, this was the only World War I one. And there's no information about it other than it existed here at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and now it's going over here. But I suspect that buried in paperwork somewhere and going back through previous iterations of different government organizations and military components, there must be more information about this. I just heard from Mike Rohde over at the Bureau of Navy Medicine that there are many, many, many more films at the National Museum of Health and Medicine that, we might want to talk with them about. And mainly we were talking about how we have lots of military medical stuff from like from around World War II, a little bit from World War I, actually not that much from Vietnam or Korea. And we were thinking, well, maybe we want to see what they've got there. And at the same time, I was thinking, and maybe they have some files in the back that no one's gone through in forever. And, you know, maybe I could look at those and see if we can find out more about this. It's, so I think, you know, I think it must be out there somewhere. It's kind of funny that we have no idea who shot this, you know, but, and then, well, I'm also thinking too of our Dr. Mike Sapel, who retired last year, but he was quite good at digging deep into, you know, where did a film come from and who made it, and kind of crowdsourcing with a lot of European counterparts that he had. And he didn't come up with any other information about it either. So I feel like it's very mysterious.
Okay. Well, one day we might know. Steve, you had?
I was going to ask you if you'd ever contacted the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, because they also have a serious collection of early films as well. And I'm not surprised that you don't know much about who actually, you know, the production, because it wouldn't have been done by a professional company. It would have been done by, you know, kind of an amateur.
Yeah.
Because that's the state of motion picture photography. You know, one of the things that I'm interested in is when cameras leave the studio and go out into the, you know, into the street, as it were. And at the same time, in fact, in the weeks before World War I broke out, a German optical engineer named Oskar Barnack, who made microscopes, had a prototype of a camera that shot 35 millimeter motion picture film. And the camera was not marketed because the war broke out, but Barnack worked for a company that is now called Leica. The original, you know, moved around in the field, but the Leica camera was already built to use existing 35 millimeter motion picture stock. So it was there, but it was an amateur's thing. It wasn't a professional's thing yet.
I'd like to take an opportunity to tease out something that Sarah mentioned, because the National Museum of Health and Medicine, which is located in Forest Glen here in the DC area, is what we call our institutional sister, in the sense that the old red brick building that I showed in my introduction to our forum, that building housed not only the Army Medical Library, our predecessor institution here at the National Library of Medicine, but the Army Medical Museum, which is the predecessor institution for the National Museum of Health and Medicine. So that museum that Sarah's referencing, and our colleague Mike Rohde, who used to be the head of the Otis Historical Archives there, for those of us on the history side of the fence here at NLM, many of us think very highly, not only of our colleagues there, but of the institution, because our institutional predecessor and theirs were joined together in the late 19th century and lived for many decades together in that building. So there are deep connections culturally and materially between the items that we hold in our collection and the objects, the artifacts that are primarily held by the National Museum of Health and Medicine, as well as their archival section. So as you talk about the National Museum of Health and Medicine, it's good to remember that we were part of them and they were part of us for many decades, a long time ago. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Wasn't that red brick building, isn't it where the Hirshhorn is now?
Yes, it is.
Right?
Yes, it was. And thanks to Lady Bird Johnson and the collection that came to the United States with a major gift, the Hirshhorn arose in the place of the old red brick. The old red brick was torn down in 1969, if I remember correctly. And so, yes, it no longer exists. There's a great Twitter feed called Ghosts of DC that runs a number of articles. There's a blog, too, that runs many, many articles about places in the District of Columbia that no longer exist, and they've run several great pieces about the old red brick. And there are dozens of buildings, and there were even more throughout the district that stood but no longer stand, that were designed by Adolf Klus, who was a famous German architect of the day, and he was the architect of the old red brick, as I mentioned. Other questions? If there are none, please join me in thanking my colleagues, our speakers for our forum this afternoon. We thank them. Thank you all very much. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. And to those of you watching remotely, thank you for joining us. Thank you.